So, hello. Today I'm going to talk about technical SEO and about decoding Google's black box. And I'm going to start with a little confession. I had that one client whose ranking just wouldn't go up, even though they should. And as you can imagine, it was really driving me crazy. And after many sleepless nights, I started to look deeper into their technical problems. And I found what was wrong, and I fixed it, and recovery was spectacular. And I'm going to tell you more about that at the end of this presentation. But let me now start with the story about how SEO is going to change. And let's start with the simplified history of Google. All the time before, guys, is there any way to have the presenter view running? Sorry. Because you're going to have to go back every single time. Okay, I'm going to manage. So.
Are you going to be able to manage it? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
Sorry, folks. All the time before 2016, you could see quite a lot of case studies like the ones we saw before of spectacular and plain recoveries of website being low and basically going up like crazy. And those are some of the case studies from our clients. And all you had to do back then is copy what was already working or simply follow the best practices. And in 2016, everything has changed a lot. And it has changed after Amit Sigal left Google for what he said was philanthropic purposes. And let me tell you a few things about Amit Sigal. He wasn't a huge fan of machine learning. He was really afraid of losing control and that would go with the change of moving from algorithms to machine learning. And he said that in machine learning system, it's hard to explain why some things rank in a certain way. Not only that, he claimed, and that's hence the title of my presentation, that most of the machine learning algorithms tend to be black boxes. And the core problem was that it's difficult to directly tweak machine learning systems. So if something doesn't work the way we like, we can't really change it. And in 2016 came a new era that, as you probably know, and I know that most of you saw something like that in your visibility charts. And there was a lot of SEOs trying to explain why this happened and what to do with that. So Google became a black box in a way. And any of you knows why? After Amit Sigal left, Google search chief was replaced by artificial intelligence executive named John Gianandrea. And previously he was artificial intelligence chief at Google, and he wasn't moved to search. Like his work didn't involve search before because search was such a large part of the company of Google that there was a lot of skepticism of moving machine learning into search. So back in, I think it was February 2016, John Gianandrea became a new search chief. And Chris Nicholson from SkyMind mentioned something that's really important, that the problem with machine learning algorithms is that we can't really reverse engineer them. We can't really understand the models they produce. What's actually important, that the results they produce are very accurate, but we can't explain why. So as you can see, change is inevitable. And as we may say to somehow create an interesting quote, it wasn't really raining when Noah built an ark. So we're in the moment when reverse engineering is no longer an option for us. So the only solution to move forward with what we see in search is to create SEO experiments. And before we're gonna start talking about experiments and experimenting, let me quickly say how Google works. Google, as everything, has its weak spot. We could compare it to kryptonite or Achilles heel. Google can't really rank the stuff that Google cannot read or index or crawl. And let me explain how Google's crawling works. So internet grew a lot since 1998. And not only the design has changed, but it became impossible to crawl the whole internet. And just to visualize that for you guys, the whole internet is more or less of 10 zettabytes of data. So to visualize it, if we take letter A, which is 1 times 1 millimeter large, we fill a piece of paper with those letter A's, we could cover the ground with those pieces of paper 20 times. And that's quite a huge problem for the Googlebot. So there is a crawler's problem. Like there is the capacity that they can crawl versus the size of the internet. And to solve it, they came up with the solution. And back in 2003, there was a very interesting patent saying that they are, at that time, it was 14 years ago, and they have the crawling capacity of less than half documents online. So they come up, and as you probably know, a lot of content online is redundant. So Google has to come up with the solution. And solution from Google was to create priority scores for some of the URLs. Some of the URLs are going to be crawled like 20 times per day, and some of them are going to be crawled just once per month. But that created one more problem. If you crawl too hard, you can affect server performance, so the website can crash in a way. And the crawler's solution again was to create what we call Googlebot crawler's budget. So there is a certain crawler budget divided throughout the websites, or actually those are hosts. So every single host out there has some kind of crawler budget assigned to it. So just to summarize, the technical SEO is really about making crawler's job easy. And going back to the weak point, regardless of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and stuff like that, Google still has to crawl your website to index and rank it. So to simplify that even more, technical SEO helps search engines crawl and index your website a little bit better. Before we go further into the technical SEO, how do we classify types of SEO? Like at this conference, I saw there is a lot of talks about SEO, but touching different sides of it. So what we did at our agency, we tried to classify SEO into different kinds. And we came up with a huge drawing or a mind map presenting that. So if you look at SEO, you can find this graph by following the link on the slide. But if you look at SEO, that's the technical SEO part of everything that's out there. So that's quite complex and quite deep. Yeah. So we can divide technical SEO into a few key categories, which are security, server setup, web technology, crawling and indexing, and performance. So those are key areas roughly when you work with technical SEO. And before moving forward, there is one huge myth that comes up very often when I talk about technical SEO, that technical SEO should know all the like JavaScript, PHP, all the coding frameworks and stuff like that. I strongly believe that as SEOs, our job as SEO specialists is to know who to consult with the problem that we find, because it's impossible to know the whole stack and all the technical aspects of our clients' websites. So why technical SEO? It's fairly low competition. There is not too many good technical SEOs out there, so it's a good niche. Because of that, you get faster results. With technical SEO, we see results within 2 to 4 weeks, even after implementing the changes. Results are scalable and predictable, and especially if your website is crappy. And that's the cheapest growth for very large websites. But what's most important for us is technical is fairly change resistant. So whatever Google is going to do, if you invest in technical SEO, that's a good way to go. And let me start with one interesting example. If we look in detail at what Googlebot is crawling, each page is not only our HTML, but it's 20 to 400 requests. And Google knows which of those requests to filter. For example, they wouldn't crawl Google Analytics JavaScript code and stuff like that, because that would be visible as visits. So they know which resources to filter out. But what if I told you that a lot of Google Search Console crawling stats we look at are deadly wrong? Let me show you why. What's exactly being crawled? If you open your Windows or Mac computer and go to Developer Tools, Chrome Developer Tools, you can see exactly which resources are crawled. So for example, that's Kogan.com, that's Australian, I think it's like Australian Zalando. And you can see a lot of different resources necessary to load the page. And if you look closer into those, most of those aren't really core domain assets. Those are mostly static files hosted on external domains or subdomains in this case. And those are this is like most of the resources needed to load that page and to crawl it. So if you look at the crawler budget distribution, most of our crawler budget distribution would go into those static resources we're talking about. So would go into like crawling CSS, JavaScript, images, and stuff like that. And we're only tracking 20 to 30% by following the data in our Search Console for just the core domain. Let me show you an example. That's the website of one of our clients. And if you look at that, you probably know this view very well. There is an average of 100,000 pages crawled daily. And that equals to like roughly 1.5 gigabytes per day. But for the same domain, if you authorize the subdomain with or CDN domain with their static resources, that's going to give you less pages because that's only 20,000, but almost 3 gigabytes of data per day. And the same if you're going to move to CDN, you're going to see a huge dip in your crawling stats, but at the same time, you're going to see a huge spike when you authorize your CDN in Search Console. What's actually most important for us, each of those resources we usually don't track can mess up our SEO. So we need to monitor our assets for uptime, performance, security, and last but not least, add them to our Search Console. And now that's one of those things that is usually not covered by SEO best practices or what's also very popular, ranking factors. So if you look at the 200 ranking factor lists, there's quite a lot of them. Probably you know the one by Brian. But there's a lot of resources saying that those are actually wrong. So it can get a little bit confusing if you try to find, okay, which factors I should focus on. And at the same time, Bing would say, okay, we have 1,000 ranking factors, when Google would reply, okay, we have 10,000. And that's getting really, really confusing for all the SEOs. But at the same time, if you look deeper in the ranking factors or the metrics that a lot of us optimize, some of them are really, really useless. Like keyword density was never part of the algorithm of Google's algorithm, the same as like social media signals or latent semantic indexing, which was invented in like 1950s or 60s and was never used by Google. And if we now look into some of the key factors we look at, like alt images tag, h1s, and title tags, some of them may actually don't really matter anymore. So that gets really, really confusing. And to look deeper into that, I'm going to quote a distilled experiment or A/B test, and they did with those three factors. So they used H1s. I think that all of those tests was run on Argus Co UK actually. But what they did is they were split testing titles and doing H1s to see which of those carry any impact. So they were split testing them within one domain. H1s, it turns out, actually affected the visibility and traffic, organic traffic. The same for title tags. But it got really complicated with image alt tags. So they implemented image alt tags for Argus Co UK. You probably know it, I guess. And there was no result. As you can see, this line should cross the, I don't know if you can see this part of the screen. Anyways, image alt tags, turns out, doesn't really affect SEO at all. There was no change in rankings. And if you want to look more into that, you can follow the link on the screen and see Dominic Woodman's from Distilled presentation about measuring the black box, which is really, really interesting. But then there is a lot of different topics that get huge, huge hype in SEO community, like HTTP2, which is, I think, one of the hottest topics after HTTPS and JavaScript recently. So there is a lot of studies saying that HTTP2 will really boost your performance, which is actually true. But do you think that HTTP2 would affect SEO in any way? Maybe I can't really see you guys, but who of you thinks that HTTP2 would affect SEO? Who of you think it won't? Okay. So John Mueller said that HTTP2 crawling should be ready by the end of last year or beginning of this one. But few months around that time, someone asked John if they should really continue to optimize HTTP 1.1 because they really do that only for Googlebot, because most of the browsers would use HTTP 2. And John Mueller said it doesn't really, he doesn't see a big advantage for Googlebot with HTTP 2. And at the same time, I watched that very closely. In one of the Hangouts, he claimed, again, I don't know if you can see this part of the screen, but HTTP 2 would make it a little bit easier to crawl pages. And before I go any further, I really like John. I met him a few times, but sometimes I know it must be difficult for him to double check some of the stuff he says. Sometimes it gets confusing. So we have two statements. So like, I don't see a big advantage for Googlebot. At the same time, that's from Google Hangout, that HTTP2 would make it easier for Googlebot to crawl. Again, it gets a little bit confusing with which way to go. So should we optimize HTTP 1.1 anymore? And just after that, to make it even more confusing, Google launched a few statements that if you're setting up HTTP 2, Google won't really hold you back. So I figured, okay, let's create a very simple experiment with HTTP 2. And what I did is I created the simplest possible HTTP 2 case study. I basically switched off HTTP 1.1 for my own website for a week. And results, I couldn't fetch and render in Google Search Console, so 403 error would come back. And my website was almost wasn't crawled by Googlebot, but after a few days, I started seeing huge spike of 403 errors in my Search Console. And I stopped the experiment when my website was partially de-indexed from Google. So you can't really fetch as Googlebot. They would show up as 403 errors, and your website is gonna be de-indexed. So when I was talking about that with Aleida in Sydney, she mentioned, okay, let's tweet that to John Mueller. And John Mueller said that he V doesn't see why someone would disable HTTP 1.1. When again, one of the quotes was HTTP2 only crawling should be ready by the end of last year. So again, we have those two statements that really don't go well together, and the result is HTTP2 doesn't really help with crawling, and you should always take what Google says with a grain of salt, because they don't really have to know all the data about that. And if you want to dig deeper, which I did after the experiment, why it actually doesn't work, you can follow the link on the screen for very cool documentation about that. But we're going to move to even more interesting topic, actually, Google and JavaScript relationship. And as you probably know, JavaScript and SEO always had like a very complicated relationship status with how it's being crawled and indexed. And just so you know, there's a lot of different shades of JavaScript. So it's not only JavaScript, but there are different frameworks. There are different ways of serving JavaScript. So it gets really, really complicated. But all the drama started with this this experiment. This article posted on Webmaster Central blog. So Google said, okay, we're stopping our Ajax crawling scheme. You don't need to do that anymore, which was fine. But then it followed with this piece of, you actually can read the black parts, which are good enough. So they mentioned that they're actually able to render and understand web pages like modern browsers. So basically that they can process the JavaScript exactly like Chrome and stuff like that. And that led to huge, huge amount of problems. So that's Coach.io, very good website for developers, mentioning, okay, you should no longer use server-side rendering for Angular because Google can now crawl JavaScript. And that could only backfire in so many different ways. So going back to this client of mine I mentioned at the very beginning, they wouldn't rank. So I started looking deeper into their JavaScript. And that reminded me about my Hulu.com case studies. I don't know if you have Hulu.com in UK. You do? No? So it's like Netflix, exactly the same thing, most likely. Anyways, Hulu.com had a very simple problem. They had quite a lot of JavaScript, but it didn't really work well for them. They're one of the top losers, and they like heavy losers in 2016. They lost 40% of the traffic almost overnight after deploying a new JavaScript-rich framework. And they lost all the keywords they were ranking for. Sorry for such metric slides, guys. Next time it's going to be a SEMrush. So those are names of their own shows, and they were gone completely. So you could only watch the show on Hulu.com, and you couldn't find it. So why did it happen? What's the key problem with JavaScript crawling and indexing? The key problem is processing DOM. It's basically very, very expensive. Before we go any further, do you know what DOM is? I Googled that, and I found few definitions, which are actually interesting. So that's either dude who owes you money, dominant person, or dirty old man, my favorite, actually. So we're looking for a different definition of DOM, so we're looking at document object model. And if you Google that, you will see this lovely chart that, in my opinion, explains nothing. And most of the definitions would actually show you that and say, okay, that's DOM, go away. So I'm going to try to explain that a little bit better for you. So if you look at HTML code, that's not really DOM. That's part of it, but that's not the DOM. If you use view source in your Chrome or Firefox or any other browsers, that's also not DOM. But if you look at the process code in your developer tools, that's kind of how DOM looks like. So that's the DOM tree. And it looks exactly like your HTML, that's true. But let me explain why. Oh, actually that's very readable, that's cool. So that's our HTML code. So if you look at this piece of code, then later within the same page, you have a script that basically says, just let me like translate that to inject new content here into this div. So that's the process DOM at the very bottom. And basically this div has this new content injected into that. So that's the process DOM at the bottom. So Google has to go through all the resources to process the DOM and have this view at the very end. So that's very, very expensive compared to just plain HTML. So to simplify that even more, DOM is where the code is processed. So it's everything happens in DOM. So we can compare it to RAM in our computer. So that's just a temporary thing. JavaScript can and will manipulate DOM. So if you have any HTML document, JavaScript can change it completely. DOM is basically fully processed code with all external resources processed. And the biggest problem is slow it's slow and not too efficient. And some of the frameworks like Angular and stuff like that, they would use their own shadow DOM because it's faster. So going back to this client of mine, it got even more complicated. It got like soap opera complicated because they were using Angular, which is JavaScript frameworks built by Google. So they figured, okay, that should be fine with SEO. And I figured, okay, we need to look deeper. Is Google really crawling the JavaScript? They have the Angular JS framework. And that reminded me about Hulu.com and their drop, also related to JavaScript frameworks. So I figured, okay, the only solution is to create the best and biggest JavaScript experiment out there. So I reached out to my friend who's like 16 years of experience in JavaScript, and we've built this website, which looks shitty, but it's the best SEO experiment to date. And we're building another one, but that's really, really cool. And it looks like that. So each of those pages is built with a different framework. Very simple concept, actually. So if you open React.js subpage, you're going to see the hello world, and the hello world text is generated by React.js. So if React.js is not processed, hello world is invisible. And as you can see again, the hello world is injected into the div above. So you have to process JavaScript to do that. And to show you even better how it works, if we disable JavaScript, the content disappears. Very simple concept. And we figured we're going to hire artificial intelligence to write the content for us because we didn't want to write all those pages ourselves. So we figured we're going to use Articulo, the robot writer, or whatever. It's a very cool service that basically creates readable content automatically. So that's how it looks like after filling that with content. So basically, all the stuff in the red frame is JavaScript generated. So if you don't process JavaScript, it's invisible. And we came across some of the problems, like some of the code leaks and stuff like that straight away. But it really got interesting if you're going to use inspect element. So you're going to see, remember, process DOM. So that's really what you see above. But at the same time, if you're going to use view source on any of those pages, the content for most of them is going to be gone. So the content is in external file. And we came across the first problems. So Google Search Console wouldn't render Angular second, wouldn't see the content, even though, again, Angular is Google's framework. And we figured, okay, is it timeout? Is the bug? Is it like some real shit happening? And we were trying to figure this out. So we created a honeypot URL test. And we basically injected a link within the JavaScript content generated by JavaScript. And if Googlebot would visit this link, it would be, okay, Googlebot processed this script. We know it's indexable. And Googlebot kept us waiting for a while. We didn't see anything in the logs. We figured, okay, that's a fail. But then we refetched all the URLs through Google Search Console, and we saw some of the URLs being crawled. That was really wow moment for us. And not to keep you waiting, those were all the frameworks that were crawled by Googlebot, nothing else. So only those frameworks, but I'm going to show that in a second. So some of the JS frameworks are definitely not crawlable and 100% not indexable by Google. Let's start with the most interesting stuff, so with Angular JS. So Angular JS version 1, if we look at our checklist, fetch and render, URLs indexed by Google, search for unique content, and search is looking if the test URL was crawled. So Angular first would fetch and render, which was really cool. Content was also, URL was indexed in Google, and content was fully indexable, and we could find it. But unfortunately, the test URLs, so internal links generated by Angular, wouldn't be crawled. So that was a problem. And Angular second was even more complicated, but let me show you that here. So those are the results of few of the key frameworks with few setups like inline. I'm going to talk about that in detail. Angular second was actually the worst framework you can use for SEO without server rendering. So it was totally not indexable. Just the URL was indexed, but that's not really the JavaScript problem. Let's start with jQuery. So inline, external, and Ajax call. And as you will see with most of the frameworks, when the script was external, test URLs wouldn't be crawled. It was the same with React and the same with plain JavaScript. So if we use external JavaScript, Google wouldn't crawl internal links for some reason. But this is where it gets really complicated. AngularJS second wouldn't be crawled or indexed in any possible configuration. So after I published the results of that experiment, John Meller reacted and he created a JavaScript forum where we could actually talk about, discuss the JavaScript frameworks, which was really cool. They noticed that this is a problem. And he gave me detailed feedback to our own experiment that we're using now to build another one. But he basically confirmed that most of those frameworks wouldn't be indexable and crawlable. So let's start with some of the mind-blowing findings. So Google Cache is totally different than Google Index. So stuff in Google Cache doesn't really mean it's indexed, or even that Googlebot saw it. Inline versus external makes a huge difference, and we're actually looking into that because that's not really logical. And bundling resources, so merging external resources will help you with crawling and indexing. And I found something really interesting for you guys. I watched one of the Angular conferences, so Angular creators, and they said that if you care about SEO, you still need to have server render content. You can find the whole video here. That's one of the creators of Angular JS. So if you use any JavaScript frameworks, make sure that they are server rendered or somehow indexable by Google. And now it's getting really even more interesting here because it turns out that only Google can process any forms of JavaScript. And Ask, we have a proof, they were actually denying that for a while, that Ask is using Google's crawlers and index. So only Google is gonna use, you're gonna be visible only in Google and Ask.com if you use JavaScript frameworks. All the other search engines don't really care about that. So there are a few solutions for if your client has a JavaScript-rich website. You can find more about that by following, again, the link on the screen. But going back to this client of mine, after fixing just a few basic JavaScript issues we found through this experiment, they really got quite a lot of visibility within like 2 weeks or something like that. And core of the problem for them was this rotating wheel. So you know some of the pages, when you load the page, the little wheel would rotate for like a split second. So that blocked them for a year from ranking. That was our worst case study. We couldn't figure this out. No one could. So removing this, I think it was like 20 lines of code unblocked and 100,000 pages website from ranking. So just to summarize that, how to be an SEO rockstar after all those changes in Google. There's quite a lot of success stories shared on all the conferences and places like that. They usually look like the one on the screen. I don't know if you can see that, but most of them tend to bend reality a little bit because that's the same website. And usually you will see this part and not this one. So the key is to look deeper. And that happened with, actually the secret to our agency growing so fast was when Expedia dropped, everyone thought it was negative SEO. And I wanted to create an inspirational quote here, so we figured we have to find the answer ourselves. And we started digging into that, and within 4 days, I wrote 120 pages of analysis of why Expedia dropped. It was picked up by Forbes, USA Today, and stuff like that, pages like that. So the key to exist in what happens now with Google's black box is to dig deeper, investigate, and experiment. And then you can really deliver outstanding results to any of your clients without having all those fluctuations. And just to give you an idea, after we started this approach, our agency is growing 100% revenue and income year to year for 3 years now in a row. We have one too many elephant, but we hope that this year is going to be even better. And just to give you the final thought, there is a lot of people selling you different tricks, but if your website is going to be Angular second, even the best black hat trick won't really help you. And the key takeaways is that Google will change, but they won't really change faster than us SEOs. So I think that technical SEO now is to create as many SEO experiments as possible to stay agile, even if those are just your beginnings in technical SEO. And what's important, Google is a black box for Googlers too, as you saw with John Miller's reaction to our JavaScript experiment. And if you experiment, you can deliver spectacular results and rock the SERPs. Thank you.